Douglas, you wrote in 2017, The Strange Death of Europe, in which you spent a good deal of time in that book in exposition of the role that anti-Semitism was playing in the streets of Paris and the streets of London. And one cannot help but wonder if one is beginning to witness something like the strange death of America.
I think that's to overstate it at the moment, but I would just start answering that by saying that the sheer, just going back to a point I made before, which is that the sheer boiling point that seems to be emerging everywhere is it's not just in America, it's very much in Europe, of course. And I just mentioned in passing, I was speaking at an event for a Dutch organization last Sunday, which is the main Dutch monitoring center for anti-Semitic crimes, and which really is the best defense institute called CD in Amsterdam. And I was speaking. There was an Israeli speaker, Ayana Hirsi was speaking, and the building we were speaking at in the center of Amsterdam was defaced by red spray paint early in the day. Somebody threw a smoke canister through the windows. There were people arrested. There was a crowd chanting all the usual "Free, Free Palestine" from early in the morning. And once again, you see, as Ruth describes, I mean, this in a city which has plenty of problems, including having had a Jew hunt in the streets of the city just last November. In the midst of all this, it is, as Ruth said, it's so easy everywhere in the world for these people not to look at their own failings, not to look at what is wrong in their societies, but to stand outside a hall on a Sunday and scream about the Jews. And from Amsterdam to Washington, D.C., this has been the tenor of, particularly, as I say, the period since October the 7th. I think there are early warning signs of which we've remained almost incapable of rising to the challenge of. The most obvious one is the one that has been thrown up very visibly. I don't really like to linger on the campus issue because most people don't go to Ivy League universities anymore, thank goodness. And so it always sounds like a rarefied point to make to say it, but just consider the way in which most of the Ivy League universities in the last 2 years have permitted violence and intimidation as the norm and pretended that figures like those at Columbia University are free speech martyrs, when in no other situation would they have got away with this if they'd have done this against any other minority. And, people say, well, the limits of free speech and so on. Nobody has yet been able to persuade me that if for the last 2 years there had been people from abroad coming into America using their time on student visas to call for the lynching of Black Americans, nobody can tell me that from right to left or from the universities to people in politics, nobody can persuade me that this would have been a mere free speech issue. It would not have been. People would have said from the get-go, I would have thought no more than 24 hours, whether I think under a Democrat or a Republican government, they would have said, no, we have no need in our society for importing of racists calling for racist violence. And yet, in the case of the Jews, yes, that's been permitted and more than permitted, encouraged. Ruth quite rightly brings up the case of Qatar. And I would say, and I say this in my New York Post column tomorrow, because I'm deeply worried about the blind spot that exists in DC about Qatar. One of the main, those of you who follow Memories dispatches will have got this earlier. One of the main Qatari government dailies wrote today on the pages of their newspaper in Qatar, where would the Zionists be if there were a few more people like last night's assassin in Arab countries that maintain ties with Israel? So there is a Qatari paper using its government-run privileges to say, why don't we get the assassins out across the rest of the Arab world, across the countries that are normalizing relations with Israel? It's astonishing to me that these blind spots can still exist. But as I said the other day in Amsterdam, and I say all the time wherever I am, there is always this follow-on fear in my Jewish friends whenever something like this happens, which is this fear of, is this country not safe for us either? Is this not a good place to be either? And obviously, there are a lot of things to say about this, and everyone's got their own attitudes towards it. But I really would just say now, as I have said for many years in many different countries, it's always the wrong way round that question. It should never be, is our country a country that is safe for Jews? It is, how can we make sure that our country is not a safe country for the people who would make it unsafe for Jews? And that is the way round that the question needs to be asked. Because whether it's in Germany or America, I don't think there's any country in the world, or the Netherlands, I think there's no country in the world that should seek the importing of more anti-Semites and the encouragement of more anti-Semitism. And until we realize how much of this has been done deliberately against our societies, and I'd just add one other thing, a point I've tried to make very often in recent years, but takes on a certain piquancy today, has been the point, as Ruth has said many times, that of course it's the anti-Semitism issue is the first sign of all of these other issues boiling up, all the other rats coming out of the sewers and causing the other plagues in the society. If you look at the social media accounts of the killer from last night and of Yaron, you will see that on Yaron's Twitter, as well as him spending his last afternoon trying to fight back online against the lies pumped out by the UN against Israel, he had recently said in a post how proud he was of America, how much he loved America and loved being here in America. And compare that to one of the most recent social media posts of his killer, whose eloquent testimony to this country was death to America, with America spelt with the KKK in the middle. These are two totally different worldviews as well as two totally different people. And we should encourage, honor, and laud the first, and use every piece of social opprobrium against the second.
I want to just draw out something very important that Douglas has just said for our listeners. You see, it is not the Jews whom Douglas is primarily worried about with the importation of anti-Semites. It is the society that imports them. And you see how dark and rotten and horrible those societies become when they embrace this politics of avoiding responsibility.
If I may say one other thing quickly on that, Jonathan, it's important to stress, because I think this will come up in the coming days, is that it seems that the killer last night had no, he was not of a Muslim background, he was not a radical jihadist or anything like this. What we have seen is one of the first, not the first, very first, but one of the first examples of this radical left anti-Israelism, anti-Westernism producing some of its first foot soldiers. Yes, people talk about the radicalization of the jihadists and of far right-wing extremists and so on. But this is a form of radicalization. To have been in America in recent years, to have been on social media, to have been at various American institutions like the University of Chicago, which this young man seems to have been at, is to have been radicalized.
Illinois. I think the University of Illinois.
Illinois.
Yes.
Right.
Please, sorry.
No, but this is a radicalization process, obviously.